Thank you, Sandy. Like I said, we're gonna start heading south from the boreal forest that we've been hearing a lot about this week, into the oak forest. I'm going to give a talk today. I retitled it slightly to be a little simpler, but I'm really interested in looking at how prescribed fire is actually being applied and what it actually results in when managers apply it on the ground. I want to acknowledge that Sarah Cooperage was the master student in charge of all this work. So she did all the work. I just get all the glory in talking about it. And I want to acknowledge a large number of agencies and funding sources for this work. And lastly, I have to acknowledge the large number of individuals from the National Forest System and the Northern Research Station that helped in several key aspects of this ongoing research project. So for those, why is it not advancing? Oh, there. We're going to head south into oak hickory forest ecosystems, and in the U.S., about 36% of all the forested land in the eastern U.S. is in an oak hickory dominated forest type. This sequesters a large amount of carbon in our eastern forest. It's got huge economic value. I did a back of the envelope calculation once, and it came up to a minimum of $500 billion US dollars in stumpage values in the oak hickory ecosystems. They're exceedingly important ecologically, and they're the most important food source and most prevalent habitat type for birds and mammals in the eastern US. Over 200 vertebrate species use these forests. They support a higher level of biodiversity than a lot of forest types in the eastern US, including maple beech, which successively replaces them, largely because they have such a diffuse canopy that they allow a lot of light to the ground, so you get really diverse floral communities and ground floral communities in these forests. And for those of us that live in the eastern US, I think almost every one of us will think of a favorite place to go to recreate. It probably is an oak forest. A lot of people go to oak forests to camp, fish, hunt, etc. But we've known for over 50 years that these forests are in trouble. This is the current age class and size distribution of oak forest. It was compiled by John Locke at the University of Kentucky using some USDA FIA data, and 70% of our oak forest is somewhere between 40 and 100 years old. So we have this kind of great age imbalance and size imbalance in our stands. We don't have as many young forests to replace these older forests as they get older, or they are harvested and or succeed into maple forest beech types. So we have this age imbalance, and this has been a function of numerous factors over the years. Deer herbivories come into the play, the high ungulate pressure, in other words. It's include land use changes, several aspects, but obviously there has been a long-standing absence of fire in our forest, and we know that surface fires and oak regeneration, the whole species group, is tightly linked. Mary Arthur and her colleagues published this refined oak fire hypothesis in 2014 that really argued strongly how surface fire regimes play a key role in the regeneration process for oak, not only just to clear out the mid-story and create conditions for regeneration itself, but actually to help the oak get recruited into the overstory. In several of our forests, we actually can see a lot of oak regeneration. We just never see it get big enough to recruit into the overstory. So fire is a key component of our forest, and it has been absent on the landscape for a long time. I would argue that a lot of the uncertainty, we've seen fire being applied on forests, on public lands and some land trusts, but we also see it not being applied widely on on private lands. And I would argue a lot of this is uncertainty as a barrier for use of prescribed fire. There's a lot of fear that if you use prescribed fire, you're going to cause a lot of damage to overstory timber. I've looked at this question. I can send through chat, I can send you links to a couple articles I just published in the last few years that says that this isn't really true. When we use prescribed fire properly for regeneration purposes, we don't see a lot of damage. But the other piece of that is there's a lot of confusion on how many fires we need to regenerate oak and how many oaks might result from that fire. And this really gets at the aspect of what is the economic benefit of prescribed fire as opposed to the economic cost in terms of overstory timber damage. So I'm trying to illuminate this benefit side with this piece of work. So I had Sarah looked at regeneration on 63 stands in the Hoosier National Forest and the Wayne National Forest. These were stands we had already surveyed for timber damage. They included several unburnt controls. They were spread across north-facing and south-facing aspects because we know how fire behavior is different on those various aspects. And we really looked at stands that were oak dominated, were going to be managed for timber values, and that had some long-term prescribed fire history, somewhere between that. Prescribed fire had been implemented at least 5 years ago and up to 25 years ago on these sites. Obviously, some of these stands received 1 fire, some of them received as many as 6 fires during this period. And these represented a majority of the stands that we could find on these 2 national forests that had received RX prescribed fire in a context of like a preparatory burn that you might use in a shelter wood sequence to regenerate oak. We inventoried the regeneration in mid-story in each stand using 15 sample points, and then we analyzed the composition and abundance in relative to the number of prescribed fires that the stand had received in the time since the last fire. We didn't have a lot of pre-treatment data. We don't have a lot of these. I get criticized by reviewers for this, but the management records just don't exist at the stand level for a lot of these burns. We don't know how hot the fires burned. We don't know. We usually have an indication of what time of year it was set, but we don't have any idea of pre versus post regeneration surveys. So this is just a snapshot in time looking at what has happened given the known prescribed fire histories on these sites. So I'll boil it down into some take-homes. They're not going to be overly surprising, but take-home number 1 was the more times we had prescribed fire on a site, the more seedlings we had and the larger the seedlings were. You can see that we saw an increase, particularly after we get beyond like 2 birds. When we see 3, 4, and 6 birds, we see an increase in the number of seedlings per acre or per hectare here. And the seedlings are getting bigger in size, so greater than 30 centimeters tall, which we deemed as well-established seedlings in these stands. We also saw the proportion of oak increase over time in these stands. These were heavily oak-dominated stands, so we're going to naturally have a lot more regeneration of oak than other species. But I want you to focus on this black bar here in these triplets. And that's the maple and beech. That's the tolerant competitors that we're always worried about. And you can see the decline in time. These oak seedlings in the 0 burn, there might be a lot of them, but not many make them into the overstory. It's that little bar of the walnut, the maple and beech that make it to the overstory in these shaded conditions, understory conditions. And you can see that bar decline over time with more fire. Take home number 2, if you waited more than 4 years between your burns, we saw a decline in seedling abundance, number of tall seedlings, and it shifted. We lost oak and got it replaced by maple and beech. Again, this is a slight increase, and this is the rightmost triplet bar in these triplets. And you see this increase from 4 to 7 and 8 to 10 years. So if you wait too long, everything you gain by burning often might be lost. And we really didn't see any impacts of topographic variables on this regeneration. So aspect had no impact. Instead, we felt that the regeneration patterns were really being driven by the impacts of the prescribed fires on the mid-story. And we saw this dramatic, we saw a bump down in the mid-story density when you got to the second burn. And then we got another bump down in mid-story density when we saw 4 or more burns. And this is what we feel is really driving the regeneration responses that we're seeing. So in summary, we feel that oak regeneration needs at least 3 fires to really respond favorably if you're using prescribed fire alone. And this is likely mediated by that mid-story response to fire. If you need to regenerate more quickly than it takes to get 3 fires in, and that's usually 10 to 15 years because of fire windows and whatnot, then you're going to need to include some type of mid-story removal in addition to prescribed fire, particularly on these mesic sites. And I want to emphasize the Hoosier and the Wayne National Forest, these are very mesic sites for oaks, very high site indexes in general, and they're very difficult to regenerate to fire or to oak. So you need to use that mid-story removal in addition to prescribed fire. So with that, I can take any questions. And lastly, if you're interested in a postdoc of prescribed fire in oak fire ecology, I have a position available, so contact me.
Well, actually, I'm going to take you a little bit farther south than where Mike was. Mike was here in parts of Kentucky. I'm going to take you right down here into the Southern Appalachians. My presentation, my study may be a little bit kind of troublesome to some foresters because in a lot of places you're trying to regenerate white pine. But in my case, what I'm trying to do with this study is look at how do we get rid of white pine regeneration. I know it's kind of heresy. For some of you who are not familiar with white pine, this kind of gives you an idea from this Wikipedia download. White pine is a very tall growing species, up to 100 feet on good sites, lives a couple hundred years. And also particularly, I want you to notice that even though this is an open grown tree, it is a very poor pruner. It has, even in somewhat semi-closed stands, it retains its lower limbs down to ground level, or close to ground level anyway. Here you see the range of white pine. This is part of a multidisciplinary study that has been reported on several times by my co-authors, and I'm going to acknowledge their participation just with this slide right here. I don't think my pointer is showing up too well. Here we go. Katie Greenberg did two reports, publications, one on breeding bird and herpetofauna. For those of you who wonder what that is, snakes, lizards, salamanders, anything that crawls. One of my other co-authors, Tara Kaiser, you might have caught one of her presentations earlier in the workshop on ecological forestry. She did vegetation. In this study, she covered mainly deciduous tree species. But what I'm covering here is eastern white pine component. I could not include this in the deciduous part or in the vegetation part because I needed a little bit different kind of methodology. Just a slight background for some of you who don't know. First of all, I highlighted this Europe thing. I just wouldn't forget to tell you in the next slide, but where I am, Pinus strobus tends to be a native invasive species on dry sites. White pine is highly productive, and even on dry sites here, it can overtop oaks at 100 years. Shortleaf pine is the historic conifer component on these sites, that I'll be talking about. And that is the restoration management objective, particularly on public lands, the management national forest. The background, some of the traits of eastern white pine. It can germinate in leaf litter. The species is mid-tolerant of shade. Its natural habitat here in my part of the world anyway is moist, rocky areas where fire is uncommon. And as you can see here, 1900s, some of our fire exclusion, fire control policy in the 1900s, we think contributed towards the spread of eastern white pine beyond where it occurs naturally. Now, fire is being returned to national forest, as Mike mentioned. And but what we know about eastern white pine and fire is limited to mainly to the northeast United States, New England, and into Canada. So, did I say Europe? And at least in the Czech Republic, European, look at this title of this publication, European Invasion of Northern American Pinus strobus. They're looking at white pine as a non-native invasive, and I'm talking about it as a native invasive. So what do we mean by this? The left photograph here, image, first of all, we have an overstory canopy of probably 80 to 100-year-old oaks. This was an old field site cultivated from 1850 to about 1900. The Forest Service acquired it around 1920 or so. But what's important here, I want to get out and show you, is even in this canopy, overhead canopy, that there is still enough light coming through where white pine is retains live foliage, live limbs. I happen to be holding up about a 1.5 meter pole here, and just to show you what the height of some of these advanced, I would call advanced regeneration. Now, if we rotate 180 degrees from the first shot, look on the right. Here we're looking, first of all, what gets your attention is this very, very large shortleaf pine, Pinus aetonata. This is what we would like to see more of on these low elevation sites. That the pine component would be shortleaf pine. However, what is here is more of this white pine regeneration. Here again, about the same size, lots of foliage. I keep talking about foliage near ground level because this is going to be important in my part of the study. What is at plenty of white pine regeneration? What's absent is no shortleaf pine. As some of you know, shortleaf pine is intolerant of shade, and actually maybe lack of fire here is the reason why we don't have more shortleaf pine here at this particular site. However, this gets down to the objectives of my study. I want to determine the effects of season burn and position on slope on mortality of eastern white pine. And I want to develop a prediction model of eastern white pine mortality from pre-burn stand inventories. And most of the information we have is for post-burn evaluation of large trees following salvage after maybe large fires. Here's a study design that I'll be talking about. The main study design, 40-hectare area, in which we delineated 9 units consisting of 3 treatments by 3 reps. The treatments were dormant season burns, growing season burns, and also control, which was no burn. And here you can see, the color coding that we have. So this was for this study, this was the main treatments that were applied, just burning treatments. Here in this, down in the lower right-hand corner here, you can see my corner is a little slow to move sometimes, so I'm sure you're way ahead of me. This little Microsoft Paint graphic I put together, that's my go-to graphics program. I happen to notice that on the lower slopes that the eastern white pines in the stand were larger and also more regeneration down here on the lower slope compared to the middle slope, where trees were shorter, more scattered out a little bit more. And I wasn't seeing it as quite a dominance of white pine on the upper slopes as lower slopes. So this led me to ask, is there a difference in slope position? So I imposed another treatment on these our study area. It was simply upper slope, lower slope, and nothing mapped out. It was just an arbitrary. When I was going up, look at my little graphics again, when I would be putting in my transect, going up the slope from stream bottom up to the ridge top and coming back down, all I would do was just note if I was in the upper or lower slope position. So this is what some of the pre-burn fuels look like in this site. 80 to maybe 100-year accumulation of fuels. We don't really know when. It probably was never burned. We couldn't find any evidence of burning out there. 80-year accumulation of fuels. Many eastern white pine seedlings, less than dBH, and this would be the seedlings, no diameter measurement, saplings, anything greater than dBH height. And although not noted on my slide, we have many large trees scattered that were up to 50 centimeters dBH. Particularly what I want you to note there, the lower live branches on the eastern white pine saplings in both of these views. Note the white arrows. This is just 2 to maybe 3 meters from ground level. Now we get into the day of burn conditions. This kind of gives a rundown on the date of burn. First, there was only one burn, single burn, unlike what Mike had, multiple burns. Mid-March was the dormant season burn, and all the burns were made on the same day. And these units were about maybe 3 or 4 hectares each unit in size. So you can imagine starting to burn on early in the morning versus when the final unit ended at late in the afternoon, that it was somewhat changed in burning conditions. But the point I want to make with this table is just look at the difference in the between the dormant and growing season burns, which are made in late April. And here I like to see that the leaf out was about the size of a squirrel's ear, very technical. However, if you look at the temperature was also higher, 18 versus 8, humidity was lower, fuel moisture is about the same, drought index was a little bit droughtier, fuel consumption was higher on the growing season burn. Interesting down there, probably important too, is the intensity. The fire intensity was 64,000 calories per second per meter of fire line. Higher intensity on the growing season versus dormant season. And now we didn't have anything in there pre-burn. This was calculated later afterwards using Van Wagner's relationship on height of crown scorch. So this gets into the notion why I kept talking about where is the foliage on eastern white pine and some of my study plots. It's long been known that fire-related mortality, at least in large western conifers, is associated with crown scorch from hot fires. Van Wagner provides this relationship between burn intensity down here on the x-axis and crown scorch height over here on the y. Unknown, at least to me anyway, is if the Van Wagner model applied to small eastern conifers in cool burns. This little graphic here just kind of shows you, where Van Wagner produced most of his relationship, this relationship that he had. The question then was white pine mortality related to tree height for the fire intensities in this particular study? This is what it looks like now. Post-burn conditions, 2 years post-burn. When I collected my data, I collected dBH, total height of all the trees in my transact. Total height, well, I estimated total height, but I got measured dBH, estimated total height of base of live crown, where I was certain that I was looking at the fire-created base of live crown, binary life status. On this particular dormant season burn, lower slope, these green and red circles indicate the live seedling saplings that were still here after the burn. And the dead ones, red indicates the dead, what was dead 2 years following the burn. Growing season, lower slope. Here, notice a little bit steeper slope, but almost all of the seedling saplings, were dead that were in my inventory line. Here was one just that shows you, how the crown scorch and height of the crown it works. The bottom 2/3 of the crown of this sapling were dead, but then as indicated by the green oval up here, the top 1/3.
Sorry, we are at 12 minutes.
Okay.
Just for you to know.
Okay, good. Thank you. So this was the model that I developed. I divided the 750 trees into 2 data sets. And here, this is the training data set. My logistic model was based on, that we're seeing here on the right, is based on 2 variables. the height of the live crown, the tree, I'm sorry, total tree height in this case, total tree height, and also the season of burn. And here we have a very significant difference between the growing season and the dormant season burn. This particular model accounted for about 49% of the mortality variation. And just as a breakdown, these lines show that for the 50% mortality, the break point here was about 7 meters total, and the break point of 50% for the growing season was higher, as you can see. So for the 6 data points that I had, in other words, this was 3 growing season burns and 3 dormant season burns. I computed the fire intensity based on the height of the crown scorch on eastern white pines, and then related that to mortality of eastern white pine mortality. And I didn't get a very good relationship. R squared of only 0.957, and this linear relationship was not significant, 0.08. And so there was a trend here with fire intensity being able to predict mortality, but it wasn't as good as I thought it would be. Maybe more data would help me on that. But that was the whole point of the study. If I know what fire intensity is going to be, what can I predict that mortality is going to be of the white pine? One thing that I did not bring into the study in this analysis was the effect.
1 minute left.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to bring in later in the analysis the effect of slope position that I didn't do, but there was a significant effect on crown scorch on by growing season, dormant season, and also slope position. Wrapping up, one last thing, I looked at bark thickness. I didn't believe it, but bark thickness also varies by slope position. As it turns out, bark is thicker on the upper slopes. So now, wrapping it up, here you can read objective 1, which is accomplished. Objective 2, my logistic equation worked very well. I did not include slope position data in this study, be it the next time when I write it up. Essentially, this is a proof of concept study using height of crown scorch as a landscape measure of fire intensity. May have some merit, maybe not. It just put it out there for what it's worth. Obviously, more data is needed for other burns over a greater range of intensities. Thank you for attending.
This project is a demographic assessment of sugar pine using nearly range-wide plot data, and we wanted to look at the status, trajectories, and stressors of the species. So why sugar pine? Well, the first reason is that sugar pine is an important component of the mixed conifer forest type, which is common throughout California and Oregon in the western US. There it generally makes up about 5 to 25% of basal area. Sugar pines are important commercially for their timber. Their seeds are an important food source for wildlife. And generally, large trees like sugar pine, you can see a particularly large sugar pine in the picture on the right, provide important ecological services. And finally, it's just a cool tree. Sugar pine is actually the largest of the pines, which has earned it the nickname Queen of the Sierra. However, sugar pine is facing numerous threats. What are these threats? Well, the first is densification. Mixed conifer forests where sugar pine occurs are adapted to a high frequency, low severity fire regime. Effective fire suppression and widespread logging in the 20th century disrupted this disturbance regime. Without frequent fires, the second growth forests have grown back much denser than they would have been historically, with negative consequences for sugar pine, which is one of the less tolerant species in this forest type. Fire suppression has also resulted in a buildup of surface fuels, which in recent years have combined with a warming climate to increase the area affected by high severity fire. Sugar pine is not serotinous and relies on having large fire-resistant adult trees survive the fire to produce the next generation. And so with these increases in high severity fire, larger and larger swaths of the landscape have no surviving adult trees. And this is a problem not just for sugar pine, but for the whole mixed conifer forest type. Third, there's white pine blister rust, which is an invasive fungal pathogen which reduces the vigor of large trees and can kill small stems by girdling them. White pine blister rust has become widespread throughout the range of sugar pine since its introduction in the early 20th century. And finally, during the 2012 to 2016 severe drought in California, millions of stressed trees were killed by extensive outbreaks of bark beetles, including mountain pine beetle, which attacks sugar pine. Mountain pine beetle is an especially severe threat because once the outbreak gets rolling, they tend to kill the largest individuals, which are otherwise more resistant to most threats. And so this project in particular came about because managers in Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks saw local declines in their sugar pine population, and they were concerned. They wanted to better understand the status of the species overall and get a sense for how to prioritize management aimed at mitigating these stressors. And so because we wanted to understand the demographic status and role of these stressors across the range of sugar pine, we turned to the Forest Inventory and Analysis dataset. That's the FIA data from the US Forest Service. This is a nationwide inventory of field inventory plots, which has existed in its current form since 2001. These plots were established between 2001 and 2010, and they get remeasured once every 10 years. So for this study, we have one initial census and one follow-up census from each of the 1,200 or so plots where sugar pine was present. And you can see those in the map on the right. On each plot, there's a network of fixed area subplots where all stems greater than 2.54 centimeters DBH were inventoried with species, DBH, live dead status. They record whether disease is obvious on the tree, stuff like that. And they also record the presence of significant, and significant means it killed more than 25% of basal area disturbances such as fire. So we combine this plot data with climatic water deficit data from TerraClimate to better understand the climatic conditions experienced by each individual between the initial and the follow-up census. And so one of the first things we noticed when we opened up this data was that abundance, whether measured by total basal area or total stem density, declined between the initial censuses from 2001 to 2009 and the follow-up censuses between 2010 and 2019. This graph shows the mean plus or minus 1 standard error of basal area and stem density across all plots where sugar pine was present at either the initial or the follow-up census. But we wanted to understand how those various stressors I was talking about were contributing to this decline. To do that, we constructed vital rate models for survival, growth, and fecundity, and synthesized them into an integral projection population model. The explanatory variables for the survival and growth functions were DBH and also quadratic DBH. Sorry, not quadratic DBH, but squared DBH. There's a quadratic term in the equation. Fire, which is a binary flag, yes or no, indicating whether a plot experienced fire between the initial census and the follow-up census. White pine blister rust is another binary flag indicating whether the disease was present on the plot at the initial census. Basal area is just the plot basal area to measure, the effect of densification around the sugar pines. Drought is the Z-score of climatic water deficit. So the difference between the drought conditions experienced during the census interval and the long run mean drought conditions. So that's getting at temporal variation in drought stress. Site dryness was the long run mean climatic water deficit. So that's getting at spatial variation between drier sites and wetter sites. And finally, I included interactions of all these terms with DBH. We also included random effects for plot and ecoregion. Because new recruits were so rare in this data set, we actually had to make do with a simpler intercept-only model for fecundity, describing the average number of new recruits produced by each existing stem on the plot. The response variables were, for survival, a Bernoulli distributed live dead status at the follow-up census. For growth, a truncated normal distributed size at the follow-up census. And for fecundity, the number of new recruits on each plot at the follow-up census. We used Bayesian estimation to estimate the parameters for these vital rate functions, and then used the posterior distributions for the vital rate parameters to construct a size class transition matrix for an integral projection model with 99 2.54 centimeter wide size bins. We use this integral projection model in two ways. First, we projected the change in the average population over a single 10-year census interval under a variety of scenarios, each scenario representing the presence of a single one of these stressors. And second, we extracted the asymptotic population growth rate from each transition matrix to understand the long-term outlook for populations under the same suite of scenarios. And now results. So what you're looking at here is size is on the x-axis, predicted survival is on the y-axis. In the top left, fire and white pine blister rust are absent, and other stressors are held at 0, which was the scaled mean. In the other panels, a single stressor is either present or absent in the green and purple lines, while other stressors are absent or held at their mean values. You can see that survival rates were low for the smallest stems and then increased with size. There's a quadratic effect for size, and survival actually declines for the largest individuals. The graph here, it only shows up to the 95th percentile of individual size. And so what really jumps out here is that fire had a very strong negative effect on survival rates for both large and small stems, but especially small ones. White pine blister rust had high neighborhood basal area had less strong negative effects on small stems. I'm sorry, that's me beeping. For growth, so these graphs are the same idea, but now DBH growth, the difference between initial size and follow-up size, is on the y-axis. You can see that smaller stems grew less than large stems, and that growth declined again for the largest stems. And if we look at the stressor scenarios, again, we see a strong negative effect of fire, which reduced the growth rates of all trees regardless of their size. White pine blister rust seems to have increased the growth of the smallest stems, but reduced that of the largest stems. I think what's going on here is that the cankers caused by the disease are actually inflating the stem diameter on small infected trees. And finally, we can see that high neighborhood basal area dramatically reduced the growth of the smallest stems. After synthesizing these survival and growth functions with our simple fecundity model, we can project the change in the size of the average population, which is shown in the red line here, including the uncertainty in the vital rate parameters. We see that populations predicted to decline under most scenarios, including the undisturbed scenario, where fire and white pine blister rust are absent, and basal area, dryness, and drought are at mean levels. The decline is especially severe under the fire scenario, and moderately severe under white pine blister rust and high basal area scenarios. The only scenario where steady state population was plausible was under the low basal area scenario, where neighborhood basal area is 1 standard deviation below the mean across all plots. If we project changes out across many censuses, we get the asymptotic population growth rate. Where lambda is 1, the population is projected to be at steady state, neither increasing nor decreasing. Greater than 1 is an increase, and lower than 1 is a decrease. And you can see 1 again on the red line here. Again, we see populations are generally predicted to decline long-term, including in the undisturbed scenario. The fire scenario looks really bad here, but in the real world, a fire doesn't occur every census cycle. So what I think is most helpful about this figure is that the negative asymptotic population growth rate, even in the absence of fire and white pine blister rust, and at mean levels of basal area, drought, and site dryness. And this is a finding that just really doesn't bode well for the outlook of sugar pine. The bright spots here are the low basal area, low drought, and wet site scenarios where population is predicted to hold about steady. So the takeaways from this study are that the observed population trend is negative, that fire is a severe stressor of sugar pine, that the population is predicted to decline both immediately and long-term under most scenarios, and that conservation should address fire risk, density, and white pine blister rust. The silver lining here is that these are tractable challenges which forest management can actually address. And finally, more data is needed to better understand fecundity and its relationship with these stressors. And with that, I would just like to thank my advisors, Dr. Scott Stevens and Johns Battles. And this project would not have been possible without data from the U.S. Forest Service and funding from the National Park Service.
All right, thank you. My name is Tim Philpott. I'm a soil scientist with the BC Ministry of Forests, and my collaborators here are Gabe Deniagri and Brian Wallace, and also May Frank. And I'll be talking about the impacts of fire severity on fungal communities and soil carbon. So this is a satellite image showing the wildfire smoke from July 2017, which is a catastrophic and record-breaking fire year in British Columbia. And so governments, as many of you know, around forest managers are increasingly tasked with this enormous challenge. How do we protect our diverse forest values, including forest carbon, from the impacts of catastrophic wildfire? So in response, federal and provincial governments here have made large investments in the forest sector to maximize carbon sequestration and respond to the challenges of the ongoing climate crisis. So in BC, the Joint Federal Provincial Forest Carbon Initiative was launched in 2017, and the goal was to use forest management practices to enhance forest carbon sequestration, especially in forests impacted by wildfire. So today I'll be talking about stuff that was funded through this mechanism as part of a larger project known as the Post-Fire Improved Regeneration Experiment. So, the widespread, there's increasing frequency and severity of wildfire, especially all over Western North America and over the world. So we need better estimates of the impacts of wildfire on soil carbon storage over a range of different fire severities. Fungi are also critical to post-fire ecosystem development. Ectomycorrhizal fungi, for example, are especially important for seedling establishment in our dry forests. So with that context, there are two questions. First, how tolerant are fungal communities to wildfire across a burn severity gradient, and then how are carbon stocks and soil carbon stability impacted across this burn severity gradient. And the hypotheses are relatively simple, that low severity wildfire will have marginal effects on fungal communities and soil carbon stocks and stability. So with that, I'm just going to get into the design. So we repurposed a research trial near 100 Mile House in South Central BC that was burned in 2017. And we have three thin blocks that partially survived the fire, and a gradient of low, medium, and high severity areas were left within each block, and those severities were assessed using the normalized burn ratio. In 2019, so 2 years after the fire, 3 plots were established in each of these burn severity treatments. We collected the forest floor samples and mineral soil samples. We extracted DNA, did all that stuff. And then I also looked at from the 0 to 5 and 5 to 15 centimeter layer, I was looking at carbon fractionation, and I'll get into that later on in the talk. So this is ordination. This is the first question that deals with the impacts of fire severity on fungal communities. And so this is a distance-based redundancy analysis. And what you can see here is that in green, you have the unburned plots in the forest floor and the mineral soil, and in red and orange, you have the more highly burned plots. And you can see that those samples that were burned more severely ordinated very far away. And so what that is saying is that fire severity is important in structuring fungal communities, and explained about 16% of the variation in the community composition. Fungi can also be categorized into different guilds, which serve different functions in ecosystems. So this is some of that data, and you can see that this is just count data, and then you have unburned on the left and then a high severity on the right. And so what you can see is that the impact of increasing fire severity on ectomycorrhizal fungi is pretty abundant here, but even in low severity treatment, there are some impacts. Opportunistic fungi like plant pathogens and molds are also increasing dramatically after wildfire, which is an emerging property in many of these kinds of studies. It's just important to note that there's marginal impacts on the low severity treatment overall, and while these skills are impacted, the most dramatic impacts are reserved for the high severity treatment. So this is the same thing, but looking at only the forest floor, and the same trends are kind of similar. There's a bit more going on here, but the point here is that the forest floor contains 2 orders of magnitude more fungal biomass than the mineral soil. So the losses are really catastrophic under the high severity treatment when where the entire forest floor was burned. That's why you don't see that extra little treatment bar here. Okay, I'm going to switch gears here to the fire severity impacts on soil carbon. I want to take a few notes about the terminology here. So this is a figure from a recent extension piece published by the Soil Working Group here in BC, and there's some carbon fractions I want to define. So size and density fractions are used in soils to kind of get at turnover time, carbon turnover time, and these fractions respond differently to management. So there's a couple fractions. There's a light fraction, which is decomposes more rapidly and turns over, say, about 5 years. You have the particular organic matter fraction, or the POM fraction. This persists the decadal scale. You have the mineral associated fraction, which is very stable, and this fraction persists for decades to centuries. And there's also the pyrogenic fraction, which is highly resistant to decomposition. It's essentially charcoal. So in terms of the impacts of wildfire on soil carbon, these are bulk soil carbon stocks. It reduced soil carbon stocks, and the primary impact, though, is restricted to medium and high severity treatments. So looking at the forest floor, and so this, the dark brown here, there's no difference between unburned and low severity, and there was marginal reduction in the forest floor on medium severity treatment. Of course, the most dramatic effect was the high severity treatment, where 16 megagrams of carbon were lost in that treatment. For the mineral soils, the effects were restricted to the top 5 centimeters, and no difference between the undisturbed and the low severity treatment, but you see 30–35% losses in the 0 to 5 centimeter layer for the medium and high severity treatments. So this slide shows how the soil carbon stock is distributed among the 3 soil carbon fractions I was talking about: particulate organic matter and mineral associated fraction. So this is the carbon stock, and we have these different fractions here. The panel on the left is the 0 to 5 centimeter, and this is the 5 to 15 centimeter. So I'm just going to focus on this panel here. Most of the carbon stock, as you can see, is in this light fraction. And relative to the unburned treatment, the light fraction carbon was reduced as well, but the biggest effects are impacted in the medium and high severity treatment. Wildfire reduced the light fraction carbon stock by 20%, 30%, and 40% for the low severity, medium severity, and high severity treatments relative to the unburned. Particulate organic matter was less susceptible to wildfire, losing about 30% of the stock, but the effects were more marginal. And for mineral associated organic matter, fire severity lowered this fraction in the low and medium severity treatment relative to the unburned treatment, but there was no difference, statistical difference between the unburned and the mineral associated carbon stock, which is kind of interesting. And there's not many effects in the 5 to 15 centimeter layer. So from the previous slide, it was obvious that the mineral associated carbon fraction pool was less affected by wildfire, with no statistical difference in stock relative to the unburned treatment. So as I was working up this data, I started to wonder if maybe some of the charcoal produced during combustion of the forest floor made its way into the mineral associated pool. And so that's what this figure is showing. It's showing a proportion of bulk soil carbon that is pyrogenic, and the proportion of the mineral associated fraction that is pyrogenic. So you can see that in from unburned plots, you have, relative to burned plots, you have this increase in pyrogenic carbon for both the bulk soil carbon and the mineral associated fraction. So even though wildfire generally reduced carbon stocks, the carbon that was left over contained more pyrogenic carbon, and some of it which found its way into the mineral associated fraction pool, which is presumably a more stable pool, which is interesting, but I mean, you're still burning 16 milligrams of carbon off in the forest floor. So long term, that might be important, but in the short term, it's catastrophic regardless. So to summarize briefly, the wildfire impacts on fungi were not very dramatic for the low severity treatment, but medium and high severity treatments did see some dramatic impacts, especially on these root associated fungi. There's these opportunistic fungi, such as molds and pathogens, that are increasing, and saprotrophs. I didn't talk too much about this, but saprotrophs are filling these vacated ecological niches. And then, so yeah, low severity wildfire has these marginal impacts on fungal communities. And for soil carbon, most carbon was lost to the forest floor, as I've said. Mineral soils were less impacted. 30 to 35% were lost in the 0 to 5 centimeter layer. Most of the carbon was lost in that highly sensitive light fraction, and the mineral associated losses were less severe in the high severity treatment, which is kind of interesting. And it's possible that that's because of this input of pyrogenic carbon from the burned forest floor. So management implications are that low severity wildfire are generally, the effects of low severity wildfire on fungal communities and soil carbon storage and stability are marginal. And so any management activities such as prescribed burning or thinning that promote more frequent low severity wildfire or prevent catastrophic wildfire altogether, of course, will better protect soil carbon storage and maintain healthy fungal communities in the long term. So yeah, I just want to have some folks to thank. The funding was the provincial and federal government was funded this work. And yeah, so with that, I can take some questions.
So thank you for visiting while I talk about tree migration and novel assemblages that may develop due to land use change. And again, my name is Bryce Hamber and I work for the U.S. Forest Service at the Rocky Mountain Research Station. So tree densities are increasing in the central North American grasslands bordering forests, and consequently this creates the potential for new associations of eastern tree species with a western tree species, given that the Great Plains grasslands historically prevented tree expansion and intermixing during the past 10,000 years. So first, I examined the reason for tree increases, expecting to find correspondence through timing, magnitude and direction of change, and mechanism. For timing of tree changes, I located historical counts, which are obscure and also difficult to find and to translate into specific data points for analysis. But generally, tree densities increased between 1860 and 1890, perhaps even earlier, particularly near settlements, but not later in the two prairie provinces of the grasslands bordering eastern forests. And I looked at climate change as the reason for tree increases. Trees are expanding westward along a moisture gradient that decreases from east to west. Therefore, increased precipitation rather than temperature change is the purported factor for climate change. I used the Palmer Modified Drought Index, or PMDI, modeled from tree ring chronologies, calibrated and validated with instrumental data. The PMDI accounts for water balance and actual effects on trees. And I tested the correlation with two change point detection methods in the two prairie provinces bordering the eastern forest. I expected the climate to change before the tree change, so a lag period in the tree change. And part of the magnitude of change is that the change is lengthy and sustained rather than like a transient flip. So one change point method identified no significant PMDI change points for the two prairie provinces during the 1800s. The other method found that only the southern prairie province had change points of 1855 and 1865 during the 1800s. And this is relatively correct timing. However, it was a short interval of relative dryness rather than a prolonged increase in precipitation. Therefore, magnitude and direction of change and mechanism were not satisfied. And additionally, again, there was no correspondence with climate in the northern prairie province. So we know that land use change has created the most ecosystem changes to this point. And timing of tree changes paralleled when land area reached up to 25% agricultural use. This land use change satisfied timing, magnitude, and direction of change and mechanism. Intensive and extensive agricultural use was unprecedented, resulting in exceptional magnitude in one direction for driving tree change, along with correlation and timing and a consistent mechanism for tree change. Land use through agriculture directly created chronic severe disturbance of grassland vegetation. This provided growing space for tree establishment. And indeed, Euro-American settlers encouraged tree growth around their houses because they knew it reduced the chance of frequent surface fires. Tree growth reduces wind speeds and wind spreads fire, plus of course, tree fields also can stop low severity fires. And so yes, land use change also excluded frequent surface fires that favored herbaceous vegetation. Historical accounts described a sequence of advancing Euro-American settlement westwards, which gradually extinguished surface frequent fire regimes, allowing release of young trees. Fire exclusion has a few components, but the major one may be passive land use changes that prevent fire spread by reducing herbaceous vegetation that provides prime fuels. Roads and other linear discontinuities specifically act as fire breaks, Grassland fires could be stopped by wagon tracks. And agricultural activities such as harvested row crops and grazing by cattle also reduce vegetation for fuels and the chance of fire occurrence. Tree presence disrupted flammability, while protected conditions under trees reduce probability of fire occurrence. Trees also are invading the Great Plains from the western side, but there isn't as much propagular pressure from this side due to fewer species and poorer growing conditions, including deserts of the Great Basin. Given that trees are expanding into the Great Plains from both sides, this creates the potential for novel assemblages of species that share similar traits, particularly in response to disturbance. The most obvious candidates are the juniperous species, and eastern red cedar is increasing in density in the eastern United States and expanding in range to the west, while western juniper species also are increasing and expanding. Eastern red cedar actually appears to be a latecomer to expand compared to other tree species, probably because it took some time to develop enough density to be noticeable. Range and expansion and increased density of western juniper species have occurred across the Great Basin and Colorado Plateau during the past 200 years, with a rapid increase in the late 1800s and peaking during the early 1900s. Eastward expansion specifically has not been evident for the western species. Rather, expansion generally has been multi-directional. So I estimated range expansion and intersection by comparing recent USDA Forest Service Forest Inventory and Analysis surveys to the oldest available surveys with the adjustments for sampling changes. And additionally, to account for climate change, I predicted climate envelopes for tree species during the 1500s and then at half-century intervals from 1800 to near present times to determine if climate change has affected range. During approximately 28 years, eastern red cedar range expanded by about 54 million hectares based on presence and ecological subsections. The combined range of western species of juniper did not expand. Range intersection of eastern red cedar and western juniper species totaled 200,000 kilometers squared and increased by 31,600 kilometers squared over time, representing a potential novel assemblage of eastern and western species. And predicted ranges during the other time intervals were 94% to 98% of predicted area during 1960 to 1989, suggesting major climate conditions have been suitable for species. Junipers are widespread and abundant, resulting in multiple ecological units with overlap. And junipers have similar traits that may allow coexistence into an established long-term association, as indicated by increasing spatial intersection over time. In contrast, ponderosa pine, another western species, decreased where eastern red cedar expanded, and likely this trend indicates a non-viable transient association during the replacement of ponderosa pine by eastern red cedar. Novel assemblages documented by paleoecological evidence captured common associations that were stable during hundreds or thousands of years rather than brief transitions. Tree migration and novel assemblages are expected to form under current climate change. Nevertheless, tree migration and novel assemblages can also develop due to land use change rather than climate change. Here, rather than simply attributing recent tree changes to climate change, I determined when tree changes initiated and examined both climate change and land use change as potential influences for tree change. In most cases, intensive land use powered by fossil fuels has caused long-standing changes that initiated a century or more before those fossil fuels changed climate. So thank you for your interest, and please contact me at bryce.hambury@usda.gov. Thank you for taking the time to visit, and this time I'm sharing information about forest disturbance types and alternative stable states in the eastern United States. And here I will provide 4 examples of replacement of unique historical forests by alternative states of successional forests comprised of diverse tree species. Again, I'm Bryce Hambury, and I work for the United States Forest Service. So there are many different types of forest depending on disturbance and tree response to disturbances. Forest classifications by disturbance and response permit designation of multiple types of both old growth forests and shorter lived forests. And also identification of loss of the disturbance type and associated forests to an alternative stable state. Savannas and woodlands require understory disturbance to remove small diameter trees, and the understory disturbances are fire and or grazing or browsing. Almost all mega herbivores went extinct with the arrival of humans about 11,000 years ago in the eastern US. So fire has been the major understory disturbance recently. Additionally, overstory disturbance does not necessarily occur any more frequently in these open forests than in closed forests considered old growth. Therefore, open forests are old growth few with long-lived trees that can be hundreds of years old. Most historical forests were only about 1 to 3% young forests. Of course, fire has been excluded, and overstory disturbance for land uses has become frequent, so successional closed forests have become abundant, replacing old growth open and closed forests. Open forests are savannas, open woodlands, and closed woodlands. They bridge the gap between grasslands and closed forests. Open forests have an open mid-story and an herbaceous ground layer with enough trees to no longer be grasslands. Literally, I mean, open forests are open. You can see through them, you can walk through them, you could ride through them and drive your wagon through them. So here are some suggested thresholds and overstory tree density of larger diameter trees for different vegetation states. However, it's really the presence of an herbaceous layer with an overstory tree layer and limited trees throughout the vertical profile that defines open forests. Grasslands and open forests typically are dependent on frequent surface fire for maintenance in the United States. So natural understory disturbances can control tree densities, allowing growing space for forbs and grasses. In addition to fire, browsers are another understory disturbance that can remove small diameter woody plants, mostly by consumption, but also by mechanically damaging trees. And it's also important to realize that established large diameter trees control a lot of growing space and resources, which provides some top-down control of small tree establishment. So here's a map that shows where surface fires probably were frequent in the past. Frequent low severity fires occurred over most of the US, but some locations had either had some sort of limitation on either ignitions or fuel, and that is lack of continuous dry herbaceous vegetation necessary for fire spread. Surface fire frequency was typically 1 to 35 years and 2 to 5 years in longleaf pine, but the definition of frequent fire depends on the site quality and the growth rate of trees. Initial settlement by Euro-Americans tended to increase fire frequency as settlers cleared land using fire. However, as human densities increased, the cultural shift to fire exclusion occurred, along with passive land use changes that prevented fire spread. So here are the first two examples of state changes. Historically abundant open shortleaf pine oak forests and longleaf pine forests covered most of the southeastern US. They were 75% of all trees. These open pine or pine oak forests have been replaced by closed successional forests comprised of many tree species, specifically broadleaf species, and also a large area of pine plantations. The central eastern US was 55% upland oaks. While it's not possible to quantify structure from some of the historical surveys where reconstructions are possible, most tree densities were low. The abundance of oaks along with historical accounts suggest open forests were common. Many historical accounts note the rapid growth of trees following surface fire exclusion. Current forests are about 27% oak, so that is a decrease of about 30 percentage points, and oaks continue to decline and likely decreases will continue. Maples are now 17% of all trees, of which red maple is the most dominant species in the central eastern region, at 11% of all trees. And as a bonus, potential treeless grasslands covered 27 million hectares, or 14% of this study extent in the figure of the eastern US. Of course, due to variation, savannas or open woodlands also may have occurred where grasslands have the potential to be. And these grasslands are not present anymore, have been replaced by 40% crops, 25% pasture, 18% forest, and the rest is salt. So American beech, sugar maple, and eastern hemlock were the old growth closed forests. the eastern United States in the past. And these types of old growth closed forests, both overstory and understory disturbances were rare. Historical areas with greater than or equal to 20% disturbance independent beech and hemlock, or greater than 15% of either species, covered about 52 million hectares historically, which is the light shading in the figure. And now the current distribution, which is the dark outlines, is 6 million hectares. And although, 15% to 20% of all trees is a low threshold compared to, 50% oaks and 75% oak pines or pines, if I had a greater threshold, the current distribution would disappear. So overstory disturbance for land use has become frequent, so successional closed forests have become abundant, and in combination with that, frequent fire has been excluded. Closed forests of diverse tree species rather than open forests of fire-tolerant oaks or pines have become the new normal baseline, but high tree densities do not coexist with herbaceous plants. Most forests were harvest preps with many entries by 1920. Steam power and railroads were new technologies, along with the inexpensive land prices that allowed rapid harvest between 1860 and 1920. Large diameter trees control a lot of growing space and resources, and loss of large diameter trees is loss of top-down control of small tree establishment. Also, the influence of large herbivores on small diameter trees has waned with the extirpation of the larger herbivores to only the white-tailed deer, which is now the only semi-large herbivore that's spread throughout the eastern United States. And so with fire exclusion, overstory tree removal, and reduced herbivory, small diameter trees are not controlled, resulting in closed forests. So just to summarize this, historically abundant open forests with some localized abundance of disturbance-independent closed forests have transitioned in state to closed successional forests of diverse native tree species. Without fire or a long time since harvest, all tree species are free to compete for growing space. There are hundreds of tree species in the eastern United States, many of which are fast growing and have great dispersal ability. Most tree species are broadleaf rather than pines, so the transition was to broadleaf forests as opposed to pine-dominated forests. And land use will supersede natural regeneration. And so some closed successional broadleaf forests were converted to pine plantation. Actually, quite a bit of the Southeast is pine plantation. These novel forests of fast-growing tree species with fully stocked forests may poorly position ecosystems for climate change compared to forests of slower-growing stress tolerators and low-density stands. Restoration may be beneficial, not only ecologically, but ethically and socioeconomically. Open forests of oaks and pines and grasslands have better resistance and resilience to severe fires or fires at all, heat, drought, insects, and wind than current dense forests comprised of diverse tree species. Open forests and grasslands are less likely to have major die-offs than closed dense forests under climate change and have reduced water demand. Additionally, these ecosystems better support species, allowing them to weather additional stressors of climate change. And nowadays, it seems like there are reports of, major bird die-offs during most migrations. It's important to realize that the matrix is now essentially invasive native tree species that need to be controlled for open forest restoration and management. And this is kind of similar to what Henry is talking about. Even with silvicultural targets that emulate the historic disturbance regime, achieving historical forest conditions is a challenge because of the propagal pressure from fire-sensitive tree species that now control the matrix. Increased herbivory may be a necessary missing component for restoration. Open forest management focuses on prevention of regeneration with rare recruitment of desired canopy dominance, maintenance of an understocked overstory, and treatments to encourage a more extensive ground layer dominated by herbs and grasses. Open forest management involves multiple tools of prescribed fire, herbicide use, and periodic harvest to control stalking, permit recruitment of new canopy dominant, and financially support understory maintenance of treatments. So again, thank you for listening, and please contact me at bryce.hembry@usda.gov for questions or comments.
Stop video. Right, so everybody, I'm Caleb McKinney, and today I'll talk about the effect of forest structure and prescribed fire on the quantity and quality of white-tailed deer forage. Firstly, I think people help make the research possible. That would be no one but Jesh, my fellow grad students helping with fieldwork, and then all of my funding sources. So we often think of forage as a trade-off between quantity and quality. So early in the growing season, here in March, we have these fresh sprouts after a fire. These are very high in quality, however, not very much of them. Move later in the growing season, so into June, kind of moderate amount of forage quality and quantity, solid for both. And then late summer or into the fall, we have tons of forage quantity. However, quality has declined greatly by this time in the growing season. So this means that forage is almost always limiting to wildlife. We all know forage limiting in the winter, that carries over into spring, limited by forage quantity. In the summer, we're limited by changes to the animals. So this has been deer nursing fawns or growing antlers. This greatly increases the nutrient demand for those animals. In the fall, we're limited again by forage quality. We have plenty of forage there, however, quality has often declined greatly, as we'll see later on in the talk. With that in mind, we set out with a few objectives. So we wanted to assess how forage quantity changes throughout the growing season. Also to evaluate forage productivity in different standing conditions ranging from open savanna to close canopy forest. We also want to evaluate the effect of fire turn interval and forest thinning on forage crude protein concentration, which is a key measure of forage quality. So all this research are performed in far southeast Oklahoma at the Pushmataha Forest Habitat Research Area, which is about 130 acres of the larger WMA there. There's a series of long-running experimental plots established in 1984 to test different forest treatment types on different aspects of wildlife habitat. So here's a diagram of our study site. So most of these treatments were named according to the following protocol. H is commercial pine harvest. So anything over 5 inches of DBH. T is the thinning of hardwoods using injection herbicide to a target basal area of 9 meters squared per hectare. The number is the fire turn interval in years. The control had no treatments applied. In the RRB, had no thinning or harvest of trees, and a fire turn interval of 4 years. So here's some examples of the fires we perform on the site. These are dormant season burns, usually February or March, using strip head fires. These are low intensity fires, doing little to no damage to these mature shortleaf pine trees you see here. So common plant species of the site. This is a shortleaf pine post oak dominated forest. A little bit of hickory, especially with low in the infrequent fire areas. The understory varies greatly depending on treatment history. In those more frequently burned savanna sites, mainly big blue stem and little blue stem, kind of taller grass prairie species. In the more forested treatments, more close canopy, you see shade tolerant species, greenbrier, grapevine, poison ivy. Then there are lots of resprouting trees and shrubs in any of the areas with prescribed fire. Briefly, we're going to look at some of these treatments. Here's HT1. You see that open post oak shortleaf pine savanna. HT2, still open savanna structure, a little bit more woody growth. Same thing in HT3, a little bit more woody understory, but still maintaining that relatively open canopy structure. However, at HT4, we see a huge shift away from that open savanna into more of a mixed staged forest, relatively open canopy, and diverse understory, but definitely a shift. And finally, control. It's kind of a mixed hardwood, shortleaf pine forest, and very little understory productivity. So to assess forage quantity, we used 2 different methods. The first was a series of clip plots performed in every treatment, once annually, every October. So we clip all the vegetation down to soil, but separated into functional group, grass, forb, legume, woody, litter. We dry it, weigh it, and this would give us the grams per meter squared of those forage groups produced. And we could calculate that out to pounds per acre, kilograms per hectare, to more reasonable units to determine wildlife or livestock stocking rates. However, this is a huge effort. It takes big crew of people almost an entire week to collect out this many treatments in a replicated setting like this. And since we wanted to track changes throughout the growing season, we also supplemented this with a Dahlmeyer frame approach, where we would go every month and collect 20 samples per unit, so usually 60 per treatment. Measure percent cover of those same functional groups. Doesn't give us the actual weight of forage per area, but at least allows us to track how those functional groups change throughout the growing season. Some results we see for ANPP, main thing here, those open savannas we see, or 400 grams per meter squared, tons of productivity. Kind of intermediate, we see those burn forests, so the RRB and HT4, the longer fire interval, but still maintaining, removing that little layer, opening up the canopy a little bit, and then our non-burn forest, really low productivity. Even these like annually burned and 2-year burn treatments, we still see a ton of woody growth. These plants in this ecosystem are very fire adapted, and they're not being killed by these low intensity dormant season fires. This is keeping those woody plants in the height where wildlife species like deer and elk can actually use them. See very similar in 2020. Main thing here, same treatment trends apply. At HT2, no fire this year, much lower productivity, but we still see the same general trends throughout the treatments. So then we move to the cover. We see it's kind of similar to the ANPP, highest percent cover for grasses in those savannas, kind of intermediate in those burn forests, very low in the unburned forests. Let me see here, nothing crazy, kind of peaks mid-summer, maintains that coverage throughout the growing season. Woody plants, kind of the same thing. We just show like this HT1, this green line here. This has been burned every year for the last 35 years. Still, by the end of the growing season, over 10% woody plant cover in the understory. This plant community is extremely fire tolerant, fire adapted even. They need fire for this ecosystem to function properly. The legume covers, here's important. We see these legumes, they're peaking in coverage really in May, even in June in some cases. It's important. Legumes are usually a high protein forage that animals can use in the summer, and we'll see summer is a very important time for animals to have high protein demands. A few other smaller functional groups. Forbs, main thing here is they peak early in the growing season, March and April in both years. Panics and sedges are really small components for most treatments, or it might be slightly higher in those unburned forest, in the burned forest. So for crude protein, we sampled 11 species in the spring, summer, and fall. So our first is a warm season grass. We chose big blue stem. We see here a good example of that seasonal trend. We see very high protein concentrations in the spring, a big drop to the summer, then a smaller drop into the fall. But here's where things get interesting. We see American beautyberry. We see the wide range in the spring. Then we see in the summer, those 3 forest treatments, that HT4, the RRB, and the control, in some cases, 10% more protein in those forest treatments than the savannas in the summer. All pretty similar again in the fall. Slender Lespedeza, only looking at the summer and fall here, is remember, not very many legumes in the spring. RRB, for most forest treatment, highest protein. Winged elm, again, we see in that summer treatment, summer time frame, those forest treatments, higher protein than our savanna treatments. Post oak, good example of that seasonal trend again. Greenbrier, strong seasonal trend with those forested treatments, again, higher protein in the summer. Same thing with partridge pea, desmodium, that trend holds across the majority of our species. Panicums, same thing. Sericea, Lespedeza, an invasive legume in this case, but still holding that trend for that RRB treatment at least. The winged sumac, kind of probably the most extreme example of that seasonal trend. Well over 20% crude protein in the spring, however declining to less than 5% in the fall. So some quick conclusions. So forage quantity, productivity, and cover are higher for most functional groups in those savanna treatments. What is a little bit of an exception, it can tolerate a wider range of fire intervals, as long as you're burning it within every 4 or 5 years to keep it from becoming an overstory species, overstory structure. Some treatments and functional groups peak at different times. So like forbs peaking earlier in the growing season, legumes peaking kind of midsummer. This is important to know that all that forage you're seeing from ANPP may not be available at all times. You might be getting some forage earlier in the year that is disappearing by the time you sample at the end of the growing season. For forage quality, as expected, huge seasonal effects. However, the forests were somewhat higher in the savanna treatments. Another way to say this, maybe proteins declining slower in those forested treatments. This is especially true for the woody species, but we do see it in some of the herbaceous plants as well. So some implications. So the savannas are maximizing the productivity of legumes and grasses, makes them excellent for livestock production. It's also good for wildlife species like deer and elk. A reintroduced elk population here at the WMA that I took some pictures of. So protein concentration is often higher in the forest, especially in the summer when wildlife needs are often the highest. With this in mind, wildlife potential is likely maximized when both savannas and forested treatments forests are available and interspersed on the landscape, as was historically the case in this area. And with that, I'll answer any questions you might have.